Thank you so much, Andrew. Appreciate the introduction. As most of y'all know, I don't really stand on a lot of formality, so that was pretty glowing. Thanks for having me back. And without further ado, as Andrew said, conflicts, anything like this, of course, we have to discuss conflicts. I have no actual conflicts, financial conflicts. I do receive donations of supplies and equipment from various manufacturers for my medical missions, but that has no impact at all on this presentation. Just saying it in terms of full disclosure. Some other plugs that I'll put out there, of course, we've got Congress coming up in Brisbane in May. I'm also the chair of the Emergency Medical Response Special Interest Group, so don't hesitate to email me at the address shown on the screen if you have more interest in participating in that. And of course, we have a toxicology pre-conference, Advanced Hazmat Life Support, and it's not just hazmat like you would think of, like hazardous chemicals, things like that, but it's a very comprehensive course on toxicology and emergency management. So if you're thinking about coming to Brisbane, think about coming a few days early. Again, if you need any information at all on any of those three things, feel free to reach out to me at the address shown on the screen. If you're a Facebooky kind of person, the photo of me that you see second down on the left, that's my Facebook profile. Feel free to find me on Facebook. I often post articles of forensic, critical care, and emergency medicine interest. Again, a shameless plug for our Advanced Hazmat Life Support course. Just putting the information out there if you want it. If you need more than shown on the screen, you can either find it on the WATM Facebook page, the WATM website, or again, feel free to personally reach out and email me. Last month, the Emergency Medical Response SIG Special Interest Group presented on mass casualty incident triage. Today, we're going to move on to disaster victim identification. From first response to family closure, we'll talk briefly about the science of identifying the fallen. My background is, as Andrew said, is in molecular biology and analytical chemistry. And in terms of forensics and emergency medicine, we do a lot of domestic violence, sexual assault evidence gathering. And I'm particularly involved in children's advocacy in developing nations and trying to help set up programs there in forensic science and forensic examination in the emergency departments. Moving back to disaster victim identification, or abbreviated DVI, it encompasses many disciplines, including anthropology, odontology, radiology, molecular biology, and more. Anthropology, an obvious example of that would be when we have human remains commingled with animal remains, such as the Lockerbie bombing. Odontology, dental records. Radiology, any sort of surgical records, implants, things like that. Molecular biology, we'll talk for this lecture. There's a whole field and specialization in doctoral degrees in molecular biology and forensics. For this, we're just going to keep it short and sweet and talk about using DNA to identify victims, or more properly, it's not that we use it to identify them, it's that we use it to exclude everyone else. We will briefly cover the evolution and science of victim identification, place an emphasis on psychosocial support for families and first responders. That, of course, is a priority of both WATM in general and the emergency medical response section in particular. Interpol procedures, and potential roles and responsibility with respect to forensic science and mass fatalities. You don't have to have a master's in forensics or be a molecular biologist to be a part of disaster victim identification. In fact, from the initial response on scene, it's actually critical that everyone be clued into the basic steps and processes of disaster victim identification to avoid any sort of inadvertent contamination or removal of victim remains or compromise of their future identification. So some of the things we'll talk about: when, who, what, how. So briefly touch on some historical disasters, where disaster victim identification has played a huge part, especially in the recent decades, particularly with the advent of DNA analysis. Who, we'll talk about different agencies, broad roles and responsibilities. Again, there's entire multi-week long classes in a particular given agency and their policies, protocols, and procedures. This is just broad brushstrokes to get your feet wet, get you introduced to it. And then at the end, I link to some pretty comprehensive resources. We'll go over the phases of disaster victim identification, and again, broad brushstroke methodologies such as fingerprinting, forensic odontology, dental records, and of course DNA analysis, as well as looking at things like medical history and personal effects. Again, I almost felt bad writing these slides on historical disasters. That's why I put the in parens there, only the barest few, because there's so many more we could talk about, or we could just take one and frame the entire lecture in the context of a given disaster. But what I've tried to do is pick representatives of particular problems or particular locations, things like that. As I mentioned earlier, Lockerbie, one of the big issues with the Lockerbie bombing was commingling of remains with non-human species. 9/11, of course, the World Trade Center. We had significant issues with compromised remains, as a polite way of saying that. The 2004 tsunami is actually a very good case study in what can go wrong, because almost everything did in terms of disaster victim identification. Dental records, or I should say forensic odontology, saved the day there. Hurricane Katrina, just something that our U.S. listeners are aware of. Moving out of the U.S., of course, Typhoon Frank and Typhoon Haiyan, particularly with Typhoon Frank and the Princess of Stars Ferry disaster. Both of those I mentioned with respect to the Philippines. Given that we're going to Brisbane and we do have a lot of Australian participants, forensic disaster victim identification played a big role in identifying victims to the Australia Black Saturday bushfires. And then, of course, the Haitian earthquake and the Nepal earthquake. Both of those are nations that do not have strong forensic capabilities. And so they were very dependent on outside aid in terms of disaster victim identification. Some challenges. There's many challenges involved in disaster victim identification. I've already mentioned a few, such as commingling of remains or destruction of remains. But let us talk about why we're taking an international. There's many reasons that we're taking an international tone in this lecture. First off, disasters are increasingly multinational. People travel more. We're becoming more and more global society. I've been in and out of the United States in multiple continents and multiple countries several times already this year, and I'm not even a frequent flyer compared to many people. Multiple governments, jurisdictions, socio-cultural and religious norms, many things that can complicate disaster response in terms of interacting with host nations, in terms of interacting with victims' families, in terms of remains processing. Complex coordination is necessary not only to ensure timely disaster victim identification, but also to make sure that we pay due respect to each of the points above, as well as ensure closure for both the team members and the victim family members. Again, definition of a disaster: deaths and or damage exceed response capability. So we'll talk about some local responses and assets, such for example, is our DMORTs in the United States, but mostly we're going to talk about a global response in Interpol. Some of the problems we can see in multinational incidents is, like, say, an airliner, a U.S. airliner goes down in a foreign country, or a foreign flagged ferry goes down in Philippine waters, something like this. There can be a problem with lack of clear command, communication, and coordination, especially as it is almost always a multidisciplinary response involving several local government agencies, public health response, academic institutions, military, police, non-governmental organizations, volunteers, etc. There's a lot of moving parts, and getting them to coordinate without compromising the identification process while respecting local jurisdictions as well as socio-cultural religious sensitivities of the victims and their family. It's definitely a fog of war situation. Given that, failing to plan is planning to fail. Some of our potential logistical and psychosocial issues, complicating disaster victim identification, team well-being, family closure, etc., include the scene being disturbed, not mapped or labeled, victims being removed. This was a huge problem in Thailand with the tsunami. Destruction of remains, the disaster itself, for example, the World Trade Center. Decomposition of remains, another big problem in Thailand. Positions not being recorded, poor records being taken throughout the different phases of disaster, victim identification or records not being able to be obtained. And when we can't get Ante-Mortem records, it is essential that every possible post-mortem detail be recorded, and that can often be a problem when, again, our carnage exceeds our capability. Mortuary deficits, this is key. Most places, if you're talking about a lot of bodies, it's often very hard to preserve those bodies once they've been recorded in situ and all of the relevant information at the scene of the disaster itself. We would like to remove those bodies and preserve them for future evidence collection to aid in the victim identification process. Failure to mobilize adequate personnel of specific training. Not to keep coming back to Thailand, but this was a huge problem in Thailand. Ultimately, forensic dentistry identified over half the victims in Thailand. However, a significant percentage of the dentists who responded were not well versed in forensic odontology, for example. Some other problems: failure to provide adequate psychosocial services to responders and family members. This is particularly important when we're talking about something like, for example, an airline crash with a very multinational manifest. This is where an international organization like Interpol comes in, because they can run interference between the scene and reaching out to victims' families in different nations. Failure to systematically obtain ante-mortem data. Again, when we reach out to victims' family members, there are certain policies, procedures, and protocols that need to be followed in order to ensure consistent data collection, which in turn, of course, optimizes our chances of victim identification. Failure to systematically manage, really obtain and manage post-mortem data. I mentioned disturbing remains or failure to adequately record details. Lack of anti-mortem medical records. This is particularly a problem, not necessarily a problem, but a complication when we start talking about a younger population. You know, someone that hasn't had surgical procedures, doesn't have implants, or doesn't have a lot of broken bones or identifying characteristics with respect to their skeleton. Or catastrophic destruction of all known relatives. If an entire family is swallowed by a given disaster, this can greatly complicate identification. So those are just a few of the potential problems. Let's talk about a few of the players. So again, identify, discuss agencies, broad roles and responsibilities. So we talked about these challenges, a few of the challenges. So how can we meet those? So some of that will be in terms of roles and responsibility, and some of it will be in terms of methodology that we'll discuss later. As I mentioned, Interpol, International Criminal Police Organization, international being the key word there, very useful in terms of coordinating multinational responses, not only in liaising with host government jurisdictions, but also reaching out to the various governments that are concerned with each of the victims. International Commission on Missing Persons, and then EU members, and I put EU/multinational consortiums. So basically I'm using the European Union as an example of a multinational consortium. There's many out there, but I just used EU. And then of course I'll point out a few things about, a few highlights about individual nations. So roles, responsibilities, and highlights of each one of these. So Interpol, the big thing that Interpol provides in addition to coordination, universally accepted standard guides and reporting format. It's a common language. Everyone all over the world uses Interpol forms, policies, and procedures, or things derived almost directly from Interpol forms, policies, protocols, and procedures. Straight from the Interpol website, a couple of things that Interpol does. Two broad brushstrokes: assistance from the Command and Coordination Center, which is at the General Secretariat in Lyon, to send messages between national central bureaus 24 hours a day. As I mentioned again, we're a global society and disasters are becoming increasingly multinational. The second thing that Interpol provides is an incidents response team to provide further assistance upon request, such as on-site investigative support or connection to various Interpol databases. And again, I emphasize assistance upon request. Anything that Interpol does, it is always with respect to the host nation jurisdiction. Okay? So they can't just come in, you know. For example, Interpol, if we were just talking about police functions, Interpol doesn't make arrests, right? That's deferred to the host nation. The same thing applies with respect to disaster victim identification. Okay, so it's assistant on request, upon request, and it's with deference to host jurisdiction. Some of the things, so Interpol takes a multidimensional approach, again, straight off the website, things that they do two things. They have a disaster victim identification conference. They actually do more than this. These are the ones they highlight, but like, for example, they have a fingerprint working group that meets several times a year. Things like that. But the broad brushstroke, Disaster Victim Identification Conference and the Working Group on Disaster Victim Identification. And again, forensic and police experts, as you might expect, a lot of disaster victim identification. There's a lot of overlap between law enforcement forensics and the forensics of disaster victim identification. So these two go hand in hand and share common databases. For example, the Interpol AFIS fingerprint database is primarily that of from criminals and from crime scenes. The working group formulates the Interpol policy and strategic planning, while the conference meets regularly to discuss improvements to procedures and standards in DVI matters. Now, I put that in quotes. It's a direct quote, but it probably doesn't do justice to how rapidly these sciences are evolving. I have one slide later under DNA analysis that just shows quantum leaps just in the past, 5 years. Policies and guidelines produced in the following areas, backed up by training programs. So we have 5 main areas with Interpol. That's victim care and family support, occupational care for DVI teams. This doesn't include just scene safety, but also, this is a very stressful activity to engage in. So it includes mental health care, psychosocial religious support as well. It's not just physical health. Compliance with international standards and forensic quality assurance controls. And this goes hand in hand because Interpol actually uses the United States National Institute for many of their guidelines, particularly forensic DNA analysis. Information sharing and exchange, as we've mentioned, Interpol shares multiple databases as well as facilitates communication amongst the host nation jurisdiction, as well as the various nations related to each of the victims. And then operational assistance to countries which lack DVI capacity, which is quite a few of them. Even in Europe, that's one of the reasons why I mentioned the European Union is they have their own consortium where they work with each other, because each of the varying nations often doesn't have the complete array of assets that they need. International Commission on Missing Persons, moving off of Interpol and down our list. The main thing that ICMP provides is standing capacity for high throughput DNA testing. So this isn't, in other words, they have labs devoted to this. And you may be like, yeah, so what? If you worked in law enforcement in the United States or emergency medicine and you particularly dealt with sexual assault, there is a huge backlog, years and years, decades of untested DNA evidence. So that standing capacity, there's a reason that I capitalized it, okay? Because that is usually the chokehold, in the overlap between forensics and disaster victim identification. In forensics, that's the choke point that often doesn't get processed because of the lack of inadequate standing capacity. So ICMP lets us process hundreds, thousands of samples very rapidly. Same technology, they're just set up to do more of it. Some examples of cases where ICMP has made a huge difference. The tsunami. I mentioned about half of the victims were identified through dental records. A significant portion of the remaining, approximately 50%, were identified through DNA evidence. And when we talk about slam dunk evidence or primary evidence, we don't identify victims solely on secondary evidence. When we talk about primary evidence, that consists of dental records, fingerprinting, and DNA, which should further highlight why the ICMP is so important and their standing capacity is so important. So disasters that they were instrumental in: the tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, the Princess of the Stars Ferry disaster in the Philippines, the Haitian earthquake in 2010, which of course is close to home for me, as I do a lot of work in Haiti and have over the years. Again in the Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan, and then more recently the Malaysian Airlines incident in the Ukraine. Multinational consortium, so for the sake of brevity, I just point out one. The other reason I chose the European Union and the examples that I chose is they're either seminal examples or they tie into the bigger picture as a whole. So the European Union, through the European Police College, conducts standardized DVI curriculum based on Interpol. So throughout the entire European Union, everyone is singing from the Interpol hymnal because of the European Police College. Some individual nations, the Australia and New Zealand, the Australasian DVI Committee, and ANSPA Disaster Victim Identification Committee, ADVIC, are huge players in Interpol. And in fact, if you go to the Interpol website, They openly reference many of the Australian and New Zealand training manuals. In Canada, and this highlights some of the fragmentation. In Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police are kind of the national response, but it comes down to the provincial level. So it really depends on the assets in a given region and in, I should say, in a given province, and then in a given region of that province. Okay? Kingdom of Thailand, they have a governmental agency, but the Tsunami, as I mentioned, is a common disaster victim identification, quality assurance, quality control case study, because so many of the problems that I listed earlier occurred during disaster victim identification after the tsunami. Just, removal of remains, inadequate storage, boots on the ground that weren't up to the task, etc., etc. Republic of the Philippines, because they have had so many disasters, they work with Interpol, but they are developing a very robust National Bureau of Investigation Disaster Victim Identification team on their own. A few other highlights worth mentioning here. Israel, near and dear to my heart. Depending on who you ask, this is Zaka is a common kind of slang name for it. It's an Orthodox Jew charity that does disaster victim identification, or as they prefer to be called, instead, Zaka is an acronym for Hebrew, the Hebrew that spells disaster victim identification. They themselves prefer to be called kindness of truth, because they feel the ultimate kindness is doing something for someone who can never pay you back, for example, the dead. One of the interesting things about this organization, just like Israel is really good at counterterrorism medicine and hemorrhage control, things like this, because of the high incidence of terrorism, they're also incredibly good at disaster victim identification. So they've been very instrumental in several events, such as the Thailand tsunami, earthquake in Japan, and then, of course, Nepal and Haiti. Tsunami in Japan, Nepal, and Haiti, earthquakes. In the U.S., just pointing out a few things here in the USA, National Institute of Standards and Technology. Again, they set standards and practice guidelines. They're kind of the go-to bubbas on DNA handling, preventing contamination, things like this. Typically, all of that's done to NIST standards. And there's various working groups. I'm not killing you with all the specific names. I'm just doing broad brushstrokes. But there's various subcommittees and working groups within NIST responsible for these specific practice guidelines that relate to disaster victim identification and particularly DNA analysis. As I mentioned earlier, we have our DMATs and, of course, DMORT. And then one example that I wanted to point out, unfortunately, kind of like Israel, New York City has had more than its share of mass casualty events over the years. So in the New York City Coroner's Office, they have their own system, which is the Unified Victim Identification System. Again, very similar to the Interpol model, but mentioning it for the sake of completeness, our homegrown model. Phases of disaster victim identification. So 4 basic phases, depending on who you ask. Interpol typically directly defines the last 3 and then literally writes books on the scene phase. So they don't set it out as a separate phase, but they go into great detail in all of the various things that need to be observed on scene, many of which I've mentioned already. So there's the scene phase, post-mortem, ante-mortem, and reconciliation. You probably want to think of reconciliation as reconciling ante-mortem evidence and post-mortem evidence to achieve identification. That's generally what we mean when we say reconciliation in this sense. So at the scene, we account for all victims with due respect and attention. There's no discrimination on any basis. No one is more important than anyone else. Government official, rich man, poor man, doesn't matter. Appropriate records are taken. The disposition of any remains and evidence. As I mentioned earlier, governed by the laws and conventions of the affected country. Whenever possible, we will observe religious and socio-cultural norms as long as it does not compromise identification, such as, for example, disturbing a scene to remove remains because someone wants to bury their loved one. In addition to accounting for all victims with due respect and attention, of course, everyone in the audience knows what always comes first if you're a paramedic: scene safe, BSI. So our first and foremost concern is scene safety for the disaster victim identification. There's environmental hazards, infection control hazards, many possibilities. So at the scene, those are our two main goals: keeping this team safe and accounting for all victims, regardless of, again, governmental, plebeian, bourgeois, dirt poor, doesn't matter. Everyone gets treated the same. Post-mortem phase. So post-mortem phase, we've recorded everything we needed to record at the scene that might help us with either identifying the victims or may or may not have determined everything we needed to in terms of forensics, but that's another lecture for another day. We've basically determined that now it's safe to remove the victims from the scene, that removing the victims won't compromise if there's any foul play. It won't compromise the evidence if we're trying to determine foul play, terrorism, etc. Our post-mortem examination is done to determine two things: cause of death, if necessary or when possible, and victim identity. So physical exam, including identifying marks such as scars, tattoos, belongings, dental exam, fingerprints, DNA sampling, radiologic studies. As I mentioned earlier, it's only those three: dental exam, fingerprints, and DNA sampling that we count as primary. Scars, tattoos, personal effects, belongings, radiologic studies, those are all considered secondary. The ante-mortem phase. So post is after death, ante is before. So what we're doing in the ante-mortem phase is, after we have secured the remains to prevent further degradation, we liaise with family members using a standardized format to obtain information used in identifying the victims. Things that we're looking for there: physical description, personal effects thought to be on the victim's person at the time of the incident, biological samples such as a hairbrush, a razor, a toothbrush, anything we can get DNA from. And then, of course, when possible, we will try and get DNA from family members. Very important here, I put it in parentheses. Again, we have a limited amount of time. If you're listening to this, there's only two possibilities. You're either reasonably well versed in disaster response, or this is your introduction. But psychosocial care of the team and of the victims is always of paramount importance. So these people who are liaising with the family members, these people who are going to be the point, they're going to be the point of contact. Often they're the very first point of contact, and they'll be liaising with the family members continually throughout the victim identification process. So it's very important that boundaries are placed on the relationship, both in terms of the provider as well in terms of the family members. It can go both ways. So very important that that is a closed-ended relationship from the beginning, and that that's actively monitored on all sides for purposes of mental health. Reconciliation. So as I mentioned, we compare ante and post-mortem records. If there's a probable match for a given victim, local authorities, for example, a coroner, or often there will actually be a board comprised of various individuals on scene. They will then make the final legal determination of victim identification. And if there's no criminal proceedings in play where that victim's body is literally evidence, they will release the victim to their loved ones. So again, 4 phases: scene, keep us safe, right? And identify all victims. Post-mortem, record anything that can possibly be of use in comparison to ante-mortem, where we obtain records prior to death. And then last phase, we take the ante-mortem and the post-mortem and compare them to identify our victim. How do we identify the victim? So there's several different methodologies. We've touched on them all in passing, so we'll just expand on them a little bit as we go through. We have primary identifiers, secondary identifiers, and combined correlation. So my primary identifiers, this is where a lot of the forensic science comes in, other than preserving the scene, is the actual identification through dental records, fingerprints, and DNA. In terms of international agencies, again, Interpol maintains a fingerprint database, and then of course I mentioned, right, the International Committee on Missing Persons, of course, does our DNA analysis for us. So dental records, ideally, it's a comparison of ante-mortem records and post-mortem exam findings. My apologies, I was trying to make the print large enough that it'd print out nice for you, and I accidentally got my photo in the way. But I had to put the photo in there. That's a Navy dentist in Hawaii, where we have our lab where we identify our MIAs and KIAs. So that's another place that's very near and dear to my heart, Commander Kevin Torski. So again, we try and compare ante-mortem records and post-mortem exam findings. Approximately 50% of the victims in the 2004 tsunami were ID'd on dental findings. It's very rapid and it's very specific, which of course facilitates our ultimate goal of returning the victim to their loved ones and obtaining closure. If we don't have ante-mortem records, which can often be the case, either we can't obtain them or they were never made. If we can do photographic superimposition, it can often narrow the possible matches. The photo has to, generally it requires upper anterior teeth, but basically, so for example, on an airplane, you would have a manifest of the passengers. You would have unidentifiable remains, but having the passengers' names would let you obtain photographs of them when you were liaising with the family members in the ante-mortem phase. So we could then take those photos, particularly if they had upper front teeth, and superimpose the photo over our skull, right, over our maxilla, and that would help us narrow down the possible matches. Fingerprints, again, each one of these we could literally spend weeks on. So trying to give you the broad brush strokes. Fingerprints, this is the Interpol AFIS automatic fingerprint identification system. It's also set up per NIST standards. 1,700 plus DVIs, successful DVIs in 2017 alone. It will exclude someone in minutes. So in other words, if you never left fingerprint, palm print trace evidence at a crime scene, or you've never had your fingerprints taken, it will rule you out almost right away. If you have left that sort of evidence, or your fingerprints are on record for some other reason, such as military, etc., inclusion actually takes longer because the standard is double verification. So we have to have multiple matches and multiple agreeances that the matches are indeed matches. So we can rule someone out very quickly, takes slightly longer to rule someone in, but still, if you're in that database, it's still pretty blindingly fast identification. DNA. Now this is all the science here, right? So, and again, this is what I did my first degree in, so I'll try not to bore you too much with the details. I was doing this, oh goodness, when the very first protocols for polymerase chain reaction came out decades ago. I probably shouldn't have told you that, but that's all right. I'm young at heart. So polymerase chain reaction, if you're not familiar with those words or PCR, you've probably heard of DNA fingerprinting, right? There's all these crime procedural shows on TV where someone just gets the tiniest amount of DNA and they're able to identify the victim or the assailant. And what does that mean? So basically, we take a tiny amount of DNA and we heat and cool and break it apart and anneal it. So you can see there in the GIF, DNA is double-stranded, right? So we can break those strands apart. Then we use something called a polymerase, an enzyme, that basically creates the missing strand. Okay? So we can take a tiny amount of DNA and using these polymerases in this chain reaction that's very precisely temperature controlled, we can take this tiny amount of DNA and amplify it. Okay? So when someone says DNA fingerprinting or DNA amplification, they're basically referring to polymerase chain reaction analysis. And how does this work? Well, in your DNA, you have what's called short tandem repeats. So DNA is made up of 4 different bases, a couple different base pairs. So A, T, G, C. You don't need to know your purines and pyrimidines for this lecture, but a base is in the opposite of an acid. That's what makes up DNA. So there's 3 to 5 base repeats are conserved amongst related individuals, and that includes population. So we can tell very quickly, is someone male, female, did they come from a given area? Or actually, more correctly, we can exclude that they didn't come from anywhere else, or we can exclude that they're not male or female, etc. So the more, and we call these short tandem repeats, so 3 to 5 base pairs repeating, based on statistical probability, the more and more short tandem repeats that we match, the greater the percentage chance that it cannot be someone else decreases. Because again, it's a very unique, that's why we say DNA fingerprinting. It's even more unique than a fingerprint. Okay? So this is very useful when you're talking about cases where you may not have a lot of material to work with, such as the victim of a disaster. And specifically, we can look at multiple types of DNA. We can look at somatic from body cells, right? That's why on the crime shows you always see them getting saliva, because you're getting cheek epithelial cells. Or many of you probably took your own cheek epithelial cells in science class, or if you did one of these home DNA analysis kits. There are short tandem repeats specific to sex-linked chromosomes, so the Y chromosome, and also mitochondrial DNA, which for humans, generally that is maternal. Mitochondrial DNA is incredibly useful for small sample sizes, things where maybe all you've got is just the tiniest bit of tissue inside a tooth, or you have someone that they don't have a nuclear family, they don't have extended female familial links. That mitochondrial DNA is maternally conserved, so it's conserved amongst the female members of the family. Paternal mitochondrial DNA, not routinely observed in humans. That's a developing area of research, but generally speaking, no, it's just not going to happen in terms of genetics. However, one interesting point that I would like to make, especially because we're talking about rapidly evolving science, is that if we're talking about, depending on the methodology used for in vitro fertilization, that offspring might have mitochondrial DNA from the donor female, not the mother that actually bore them, but the mother that donated the genetic material. Okay? It depends, again, it depends on the exact IVF procedure, but an interesting point for forensic analysis relative to our discussion. Those are our primary identifiers. Our secondary identifiers. So personal description, personal effects, medical findings other than dental, fingerprints, or DNA. Combined correlation. Even if we have a primary identifier, we want to get as much supporting evidence as possible. For example, say your primary identifier was DNA and it turns out that that sample was contaminated, cross-contaminated between two different sets of remains. So now what are you going to do? If you were just relying on the DNA, you got nothing. So even if we have a primary, particularly if that primary is DNA, we get as much supporting evidence as possible. We don't go, oh, we've got one thing, it's a slam dunk. We want as many corollaries as we can combine together to strengthen our identification of that disaster victim. What are some ways that you can get involved? So we've gone over some historical disasters, some of the problems encountered in disaster victim identification, different agencies, different countries, how they address those particular problems or what their particular areas of expertise may be, or how they've contributed to the evolution of the science as a whole. We've talked about specific sciences involved in identification. So what if you're not a molecular biologist and you don't know polymerase chain reaction from a hole in the ground? Can you participate in disaster victim identification? Absolutely. And inevitably, someone always asks, right, because it sounds sexy and cool. They're like, oh, can I play with Interpol? Well, if you want to work for Interpol, yes, absolutely. As long as it's basic requirements. You have to be an 18-year-old national of an Interpol member state. The USA is an Interpol member, and you have to have relevant training degree for the job you're applying for. That being said, as I said, there's always someone who asks that, but that's not applicable to the vast majority of the people in the audience. You're not going to drop everything and run out and join Interpol. So what kind of roles can you play in disaster victim identification? Typically, it's with a local agency coordinating with Interpol command coordination or response team. Some examples of that, of course, would be search and rescue or search and recovery. In the United States, our national NDMS, disaster medical assistant teams, our DMATs, our DMORTs, our disaster mortuary operational response team. I'm sure many of you work with canine teams. DMORT was very involved in both 9/11 and Katrina. Of course, I'm Navy, so you got to get the Navy perspective. In the Navy, we have a Casualty Assistance Calls Officer, CACO. It's a unique term in the Navy, but the role exists through all the branches of the armed forces. I was a CACO. The purpose of the CACO, of course, is to provide information assistance to the next of kin. Critical incident stress management, again, mental health of both the victims' families as well as the team members. I put an asterisk next to that. Again, if this isn't your first rodeo, there's some controversy around that. You can do something as simple as rehab crews. I say rehab because, of course, paramedic, fire rescue, when you're talking about things like ongoing fires, it's very important, again, health and well-being of the crew members. Well, it's the same thing when we're doing disaster response. People are going to push themselves. They're going to go, go, go. There's a moral pressure to resolve and identify these victims. So I say rehab crews, it's a firefighting example, but it's utterly applicable as how you could participate in terms of a disaster victim identification team. And in terms of forensic anthropology, there are all kinds of unskilled labor things, literally sifting dirt. I mean, there's so many things that you could do in terms of unskilled forensic anthropology. So here's just a few examples of ways that you can play a role in disaster victim identification. Again, if your role is as a medical responder and you're helping the survivors, I would implore you to work with the disaster victim identification teams, incident response teams, to make certain that in saving the living, that you don't compromise our identification of those who have passed. So many things that you can do there, even if you're not responding as part of a victim identification unit. If you're responding as a medical responder, you can still help preserve the scene integrity. References, you can get everything you need off the Interpol website, and why shouldn't you? The rest of the world does. Some specific things you can get off: latest version of the Disaster Victim Identification Guide, standardized form there, Disaster Victim Recovery Form. As I mentioned, the DVI forms, that's what we use to liaise with family members, training packages from Australia and New Zealand in terms of governing principles, DVI governance. Again, many things there. That family liaison strategy, that's gold. That's good for anybody that interacts with family members, either as a healthcare provider or in terms of victims. And of course, QA, QC. References, continued Interpol guidelines and links I listed on the previous two slides, more than adequate. If you want recommendations with respect to references regarding specific topics such as DNA analysis, don't hesitate to open that genie's bottle, reach out, email me, Facebook me, whatever. I'll be delighted to drown you. I am literally looking at a yard of forensic textbooks on my desk right now. So I'll be more than happy to point you in the right direction. As they used to say on the show Grizzly Adams, it's like, skin that bear, Pilgrim, I'll bring you another one. You work your way through the Interpol guidelines, and you need some more, you holler at me. I'll hook you right up. Giving credit where credit's due, unless otherwise stated, all imagery is either public domain or sourced from Wikipedia and credited accordingly. Again, shameless plug alert, don't hesitate to reach out to me for the emergency medical response. I hope to see you in Brisbane, and I hope to see you at the toxicology AHLS pre-con, even more. And yes, if you are interested, we are also offering instructor training in AHLS. So you can find out more about that on the website, or you can reach out to me personally at the email on your screen. Again, thank you very much for having me. We've got a few moments for questions. If you got them, bring them on.
All right. Hey, can you hear me, Sean?
Crystal clear.
Okay, so I was having a few audio issues, so I actually had to call in here, so I just wanted to make sure. So now, I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the webinar, but we have the opportunity here to have a discussion, a Q&A with Sean. And so as the participant in the audience, you can either send me a message using the question feature, or there's a little hand icon that you can click on, which will then flash, and you can essentially raise your hand, and we can unmute your microphone, and you can ask a question directly to Sean. But I do have one question here and one comment. First question is from Allison McCauley, and she asked if you have any Canadian suggestions for how she can help.
Allison, if you email me, there is a really great working paper that I would be happy to send you that is specific to Canada. So please email me, and I will, again, it's just one paper, but it is chock full of things for you. And it is cross-provincial. So you'll find no matter where you live in Canada, that there will be things of use to you in that. So please email me for that, and I'll be delighted to send it to you straight away.
And then Allison has a follow-up comment, just pointing out that she agrees that Grizzly Adams is a great television show.
Outstanding.
I remember that from when I was a kid. That just dates me a bit, I suppose.
Nick at Night, man. Nick at Night.
did anyone have any other questions? We kind of are at the hour point here, but we could certainly go over a bit if folks had questions. I'm not seeing too many. We may have a bit of a shy group here.
And you're more than
Allison,
welcome to reach out to me by email or Facebook with questions if you think of something afterwards, or if you don't want to hang out now.
Yeah, Allison just did indicate that she will send you a follow-up email as well. So,
outstanding.
Well, I don't want to keep folks on here any longer than, oh, I got another one here that came in.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, everyone seems to be commenting on Grizzly Adams. That's hilarious. There's a question from Leanne Olson. Leanne says, what issues do you find with international standards for DVI? Are there huge differences?
No, it's more diplomatic and socio-cultural religious. And that's why I put such an emphasis on Interpol. And when there is something, in terms of ongoing quality assurance, quality improvement, that's why I pointed out that the Thailand tsunami it's a huge case study, and everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And so that's now been 15 years in the past. So it really is becoming more of a global thing, where the actual policies, procedures, and protocols of victim identification itself are becoming rapidly standardized, and it's more navigating the socio-cultural, political, potential quagmires where problems arise. And that's, again, where an agency like Interpol is so essential, because they're they're an umbrella organization, so they're nonpartisan.
Thank you, Sean. Well, we'll give a few moments here for Leanne to send any follow-up. We did get a comment here from Jennifer Packiam. She says, thank you, fantastic presentation.
And thank you, Ms. Jennifer. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Well, I think that looks like we're coming to the end here. I don't see any other new questions coming in, and we just have a shy group. No one wants to ask a question. Oh,
it just depends on the topic. If I was doing damage control resuscitation, we'd be getting all kinds of questions. So, we got a bunch of healthcare providers in the audience, and, once the body starts cooling, they're done. So,
yeah. A couple of quick other comments.
Time I'll do something on keeping them alive.
Well, we do have one last question here, it looks like. So, Leanne, looks like you answered a question. She says, great, thanks. Another comment from Jennifer Lumen says, thanks, great summary. I've done DMAT disaster relief for 20 years, and I am disaster fellowship trained. Well done. See you in Brisbane. Oh, great. We have a participant here who's going to be in Brisbane.
Outstanding. Yeah, it's a lot to summarize in a tiny bit of time. So I really appreciate the vote of confidence, ma'am. Thank you very much.